So, hello, good evening, and welcome to our last development stream for 2019. And since all of our patrons, except for one, have voted for the development streams to be open to the public from now on, this one will be, and we hope that we'll get some people watching without us promising any free plugins every time. So let's see how this goes. And yeah, hello to all of you. Today we'll be talking about the plugin of the month that our patrons have voted for December 2019. And we had the option of voting for an improved UV transform tool, a limited region manager, an oscillator node, which is a really nice option that came in last month, do some Spline Toolkit maintenance. And yeah, the overwhelming majority voted for the Spline Toolkit maintenance, which we um, basically proposed as an intermediate step for the Spline Toolkit to allow us to add more complex functionality afterwards. So it's prerequisites for something like a spline deformer or renderable splines. And what we have on the list for the Spline Toolkit for this month is an option to evaluate a spline in a real world distance. So you can say, okay, I would like to have this spline evaluated along its length at 0.5 meters, as opposed to just a percentage of the spline. And in the end, this will also make something like attaching bones to splines a lot easier eventually, because not only can you position the bones along a spline at a certain distance, but you can also use the rest length of the bone to position the next one and keep those at the proper position on the spline. Um, Another thing is to clean up the right-click menus in general, and specifically add some more options to the right-click menu on the list of shapes, such as duplicating a shape. That was something that was requested a month ago. Then also drag and drop reordering of the shapes. And if I remember the SDK correctly, that's only possible in 2019 and not 2018, but I'll double check on that. Then an internal cleanup of the code to prepare it for future tools, basically kicking out things that aren't really used anymore, or try to optimize things, try to refactor common code to only be written once, even if it's used multiple places, things like that. Then also, again, go over the internal caches that are being computed. One is being computed for drawing, one for evaluation, to make sure they're only computed when necessary and not too often, which may happen now. One thing I want to look at is to allow for the shape changes to be motion blurred. The thing is, right now we have an evaluation cache that takes the shape changes into account, but there's only essentially the cache for one timestamp that's generated and used when rendering one frame. And for motion blur, I would need to create two caches per frame, one for the beginning and one for the end of a frame. And that makes it a bit trickier, but should be doable. Then there's still a slight orientation issue along splines, something I just need to dig into, double check the code, and maybe try out some things until it orients as it should. And we also rely on all of you, and by that I mean all the patrons, to get back to us if you have to work with the spline tools. Sorry, that's my mobile and Facebook. Um, so basically, we rely on you guys to get back to us and tell us what gripes you have with the Spline Toolkit as it is right now. Look at the existing tools. tells about, suggestions you have for improvements, even if it's something like, you think that the label of a certain control doesn't really say what it does, or it's not clear enough. Please do get back to us with things like that, with anything, and we'll see what we can do this month. So yeah, that's where we absolutely rely on you. And I have to say, kudos to Mark Warner, who actually wrote a big post about suggestions he had. And one thing was that currently, when you click the button to add a spline, you still have to click another button to actually edit that spline that you just added. And he would like that to be streamlined. So that's something I did already. I'm going to show you in a second. Now there is an add and edit spline button, which adds a spline, doesn't open the user interface for the primitive, and directly launches the edit tool for that selected spline that was just added. And since we are adding animating along the length of a spline using a physical length, one thing that he would like is a way to animate a spline from 0 to 100%, but have the speed constant along the spline. Currently, if you're using the normal 0 to 100% value, the speed may change depending on how close and how far those knots are away from each other. And actually, given that we have the distance-based evaluation right now, what I can do is basically take the current distance that's supposed to be evaluated, or take the percentage that's being evaluated, and turn that into a distance of based on the complete length of the spline, and then evaluate that as opposed to a displacement percentage that goes straight into the number of knots we have in the spline. Enough talk though, let me just show you what I've added so far, just to give you an idea of what I was actually talking about. And this is a very hot build. I just finished the last code changes about half an hour ago. So if something crashes, it's the compiler, it's not me. Yeah, don't look at me. All right, so the first thing, add an edit spline. As you can see, I have a new button here. So what happened before that, you would add a spline and it would pop this open. And then if you get a new null object, just go into perspective view. All right, I hit a new null object. And then you would go to spline edit and then just start editing that spline. I'll just delete that. All right. What we have now, we have an add and edit spline. As you can see, it creates something. We are in the spline editor already, and you can just click and draw. So it's one button here, and then you're done and ready to edit your spline. So that has been done already. And let's just delete this knot and make this a little bit simpler. Yeah, this is, for example, something I want to add as well. Actually, it should work. Yeah, there we go. And basically, have a look at these right-click menus and see if I can clean those up a little bit. Let's just create a really, really stupid spline like this. But what it shows is that we actually have two knots that are very close to each other. Let me just smooth them automatically. Ah, damn. Didn't want that. Let me just delete that knot, turn off edit and append. There we go. And this one is automatic smooth. Make this automatic smooth as well. This one also. I think this one is, yeah, all right. So I've got the spline here. And I've got two knots that are quite close to each other and two that are far away. And do I have any objects I can use here? Let me just check. The arrow sucks. Might as well just create a null object. Assign a primitive to it, or shape. And yeah, sphere is good enough. All right. So what I'm going to do is, because that's the only one I've worked at the moment, I'll add a nodal motion. Open the node editor. And spline evaluation is the one that has been worked on. Open it, select the spline. That's also an issue I still need to work at. Slight user interface problem. It's lots of small things that need a second look and some cleaning up. Come on, where is it? There we go. Position goes to the position. And let's have a look at the evaluation options we have here. So what I have added is we used to have two buttons here for the evaluation type as spline displacement and span displacement. And displacement in this case is displacement along the spline or moving along the spline. So currently 0%. If we set it to 50, then you will see that the item, the ball, has moved along the spline. Let me just turn off the spline tool because that gets in the way. All right. So, and we can animate this. So if I enter the graph editor at 0, I'm at 0%, and I want to go, it's 120 frames, 100%, bam. And as you can see, we're animating along the spline. And this should actually not be 50, but 0%. All right, there we go. And what you can see is that, if I play this back, it's fairly fast in the beginning. Then it slows down because we have 3 spline segments, but out of those 100%, the distance between those, or the distance on this spline segment in the middle, is 1/3 of the total time that we're taking. And you have this kind of motion that's fairly fast, slows down, then it's fast again because the next segment is longer. Now, what I've added is we have the spline and the span displacement. We have the relative distance and the absolute distance. Now, relative distance is also a value from 0 to 100%, but it doesn't take the spline spans or the spline components into account, but only the total distance or the total length of the spline. So if I go to relative distance and play this back, then you will notice that the speed is absolutely even along the spline. See, it doesn't speed up over there, it doesn't slow down anywhere. It's absolutely even because it just looks at the length of the spline, and the percentage that you enter in the displacement here is now in relation to the length along the spline and not in relation to the position between the spline spans. One thing I still have to add or change is the evaluation type also changes the kind of look ahead that you can use. As you can see here, if it says displacement there, it's displacement at the bottom. But I'm not taking that into account yet, but that's just to come. I just added the relative distance evaluation type 45 minutes ago or something. No, 1 hour ago, but then I got it to work half an hour ago. All right. So the interesting thing about this is that it's based on the real world units, real world length, but it's still percentage based. So if you change the length of the spline, then it's still going to be an even motion along the spline from the beginning of the spline at 0% to the end of the spline at 100%. And actually, if you look at the spline itself, open the properties, it also shows you the length of the spline now in real world coordinates. And if you go to the spline editor now, something is doing something in the background. And you take a point and you move it, then you will see that the length actually adjusts to the current length of the spline. And if I drop this again and go back to my object, even though it's using something that is actually length-based, it's still computing it percentage-based, and the speed along the spline is still constant. Another option you will have is that the other evaluation type is absolute distance. And if you look at the displacement control here and the look ahead displacement control down there, if I go to absolute distance, those swap out. And the distance control actually is an absolute distance now in meters. And I can say, all right, at frame 0, it's 0 meters, and at frame 120, I just want it to be 5 meters from the start of the spline. And that's precisely where it's going to be. This is 5 meters from the start of the spline. And the spline itself right now is, 7.1 meters. So this allows you to precisely position an item on the spline using real-world coordinates. And where this gets interesting is that it's also a good basis for using a spline to control bones, because bones give you a position where the bone's attached to or positioned along the spline. But bones also have a length in real-world coordinates, and at their tip is the position where the next spline is going to be attached. And if you want splines to deform, bones to be attached to a spline but still remain as a chain, you would want to make sure that the next bone attaches to the previous one using the length of the bone itself. And now that's going to be possible. You will be able to do it manually using the node or eventually the motion control plugin, which is also going to get these features. I just added them to the node right now, but they're going to be ported over to the motion control plugin as well. And eventually, but that will need some thinking, some designing, some use cases, there might actually be a plugin that's going to be specifically designed for bones, and maybe even something that allows you to take a whole bone chain and automatically attach all of the bones in that chain to a spline. I mean, that would be a nice project in the future then for the Patreon. But yeah, so these are the things I've worked on so far. And actually, I think that the relative distance thing with the length works really, really well. Quite happy to get that sussed out. And it just makes animating something along the spline a lot nicer, especially since now, if you go into the envelope and you actually start to change, the tension or the shape of the envelope, what happens along the spline as it animates, or as the item animates along the spline, actually makes a lot more sense, since it's actually based on distance units as opposed to evaluation percentage units. And to be fair, I was kind of afraid that this could be very expensive to compute, because to compute the position on a spline, I basically have to go through my evaluation cache and basically compute the distance from every point on that cache to the previous one, add them up, and so on. But what I've done now is I'm basically pre-computing not only the positions along the spline for the evaluation cache, but also the distance of that current cached point to the very beginning of the spline, which means that to find a certain distance on the spline, all I really need to do is step through the cache and then find the first distance in the cache that's larger than the one I'm looking for, and then I know that I'm in the right area, and do some tweaking, and I can easily find the position that I'm actually looking for. So yeah, that is essentially the current state of the things. I've also added a distance input and a look ahead distance input here as well. So that way you can keep them separate. Currently, depending on the evaluation type, either the displacement percentage or the absolute distance envelope up here are being saved. But as you can see, you can switch between both of them and the envelopes are still there. The only thing that happens is when you actually save it, and that's just to save space in the scene, it only saves the envelope and the value that corresponds to the current evaluation type. So the first three use a percentage and the last one uses a distance. I'm also still not happy with the label displacement here. That's kind of from Fusion. But yeah, if you have any better ideas of how to call that, because it's basically the displacement is essentially displacement along the curve as a percentage. And yeah, I'm still struggling with what else to call that. So yeah, those are the current changes. Um, so all of that distance stuff is going to be added to all the other nodes that evaluate the spline. And also one thing that I've talked about is if we go to the spline editor, come on, drop it, there we go, and open the numeric panel. One thing I want to do is once I have shapes, I want to be able to reorder them. Let me just add one. There we go. And auto keys in all channels. Yep. Ah, that should, but it doesn't. There we go. All right. So I've got two shapes here. I would like to be able to drag and click them, reorder them in here. Yeah, that's the thing with offset. It does have a different connotation as well, just as displacement does. Um, so yeah, I mean, I could just call it evaluation percentage, but that's kind of a bit, I don't know, dumb as well. Um, Maybe just write down a list of like 20 words and then kick out all of them and end up, with displacement again. I did you actually with the shape animation, I did use progress, which kind of makes sense. We should relabel it as shape progress, but the context here is shapes, so that makes sense. But yeah, the displacement thing is a bit tricky. So yeah, one thing here is the reordering of the shapes using drag and drop, which will not change the progress envelope, by the way, and also duplicate shape, which I've added into the menu, but haven't. There's no code behind that yet. So that way you can take an existing shape with all the keys and everything, and just create a second one that's a copy of whatever you're currently selecting here. So yeah, those are the things on my list. And I have to say, I think the whole distance-based evaluation is a big step forward. And that's also something that is going to be so useful for the other add-ons or the additions to the Spline Toolkit later on, like, for example, deformation along a spline also needs to evaluate the spline according to a distance along the spline. Because let's say you have, a tube or something that's being displaced by the spline, you will use, let's say, the x coordinate to find out which part of the spline to hook onto and to follow. And the x coordinate of that tube, of that part of that tube, is going to be a coordinate. It's going to be going to be a distance. So yeah, I'm afraid that's pretty much all we have to talk about today. Um, I'm actually going to plug something, but I suppose that those of you that follow us on Facebook and everything already know. But yeah, let's have a small intermission here, because why not? If I can just find the picture. Where is it? Yes, there we go. So yeah, this is the commercial break. We currently have Infinimap Pro EXR on sale until the end of the year. We've massively dropped their prices, frame D as well. So if you're interested in getting any of these, now would be the perfect time. Infinimap Pro is, I think, 400 something euros cheaper. Infinimap EXR, 300 and something euros, and even frame D dropped by 60 euros. So yeah, that's just something that you might want to fill your stockings with. And already that's the end of the segue. I mean, I'm not Linus here, not quite as elegant. Distribute even. Well, the problem is to be able to, if you just want to position something on the spline but not animate it, um, but want to do it evenly, you would have to have a node that's attached to every item that you distribute on the spline. The problem with that is the distribution depends on the amount of items on that spline and on which positions are already taken. So that could be quite tricky. If we had something like a spline-based instancer, and I'm not saying that this is not on the list of potential add-ons eventually, then yeah, certainly you would be able to distribute it evenly or with random offsets along a spline. But right now you would essentially need to do it manually by going into every node and entering a different percentage in there. Um, you might be able to do something like extract if it's clones of an item. There are nodes, and I think we have one as well, that allows you to extract the number of the clone, which is the number that Lightwave has in square bracket and in round brackets. I'll just go to the other object. Here, that's a null. So if you clone it, then you know it's null too. There's nodes to extract that number, and you might be able to multiply that number by something else and then use that to place something along the spline using nodal motion. But then you would probably want to do something like node meister or so. So you actually only need to create that node graph once, but you can edit it for every instance where it's being used. And yes, JF, it is a toss-up. I know. I've been. It's one of those things where the concept is easy, and sometimes the code is easy to write as well. And then you sit there and you're like, okay, but what do I call this? What makes sense? And I mean, in mathematically, it's a parametric evaluation where that what you're using to evaluate a longer spline is usually just called T or N or something like that. So that doesn't really make sense as well. But yeah, I'll find something. So yeah, that's really all I have to show. Well, you know what it's like. I mean, you pick something and then you're like, you're working on that code and you look at it again and you're like, yeah. To be fair, you are right in one respect. I picked it, so don't look back. One place where I can't actually change it is as the name of the node input, because the when loading and saving a node graph, the inputs and the outputs are matched by the names of the nodes of the inputs and the outputs. Um, so if I change this from displacement to something else, that would break all existing scenes. So I can't change it here, but I don't know, I might just find something in here that's a bit more descriptive. The same goes for the spline displacements, span displacement. It's a bit meh. It's just, it's itching me, and sometimes you have to scratch. So yeah, um, I think that's it for now. Um, I'll try to get as much as that into the code until next week, because we kind of have a shortish month. We would like to have the Q&A before Christmas as well. That gives us some time to celebrate, and that gives you some time to celebrate. And so what I'll try to do is basically get the new functionality that's up front into the code before that, so that you get, a new release in the middle of next week, maybe Wednesday. And then we can talk about that at the Q&A on Friday. And then, then you're all free to go off to your Christmas holidays or whatever you're doing until next year. And who knows, we will certainly work a bit more on that until the end of the year, and try to polish things a bit more. So that's our plan for this month. And yeah, what can I say? Thanks to all of you for joining us today. I can see that we have a little bit less viewers than we did the last time, but probably that's because we're not giving away free plugins. I think so. But anyway, thanks for joining us. And yeah, we'll see you at the Q&A. And everybody who is not a patron, there is links underneath the video to join us if you would like to. And as soon as you join us, you get the current build of the db&w tools, which includes all of the Spline Kit tools that we've developed so far, plus much more. So basically, the later you join, the more plugins you get, but the earlier you join, the more you support us, which we appreciate a lot. And also the more influence you have in what we develop, what we think about when we develop. And as you can see by that post I showed at the beginning by Mark, he had some brilliant ideas there, and they work extremely well. So thanks to Mark for helping us out, and thanks to everybody else for supporting us and for taking the time to communicate with us, to look at the silly GIFs that we post on our Discord, and maybe even to look at the development screenshots as well and comment on them. So yeah, thank you very much. And I wish all of you a good night, evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Bye bye.